Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. This time, our topic is compensation. What we're really talking about here are direct payments. And there are two types of compensation that we will deal with in the course, direct and indirect. And direct is just what it says, payments to you, reimbursements. Indirect is really about benefits and things that are policies and not really payments of money. So we'll talk about that in another time. So when we talk about direct compensation, it's about your paycheck. And it doesn't include benefits. Um, and certainly, it is one of the most important things in the contract that happens when someone goes to an organization and decides to work there. Salaries and wages are certainly very significant. They matter, and they matter in the attracting and retaining and motivation of employees. Getting pay right is one of the most important things that an HR manager can be concerned with. And as well, the HR manager should look at compensation as a strategic uh, decision to make. You have to think strategically about the pay level you're offering, the pay structure that you've created, the way you evaluate jobs, the incentives that may go along with it, and so forth. And like it says here, you can see how significant these results are. The way you handle your direct compensation really does affect how well you compete in the marketplace. If you don't pay as well as your big competitors, you're at a disadvantage. You have to pay what the going rate is at the market or the region or whatever it is, whatever those factors apply, because if you don't, people won't stick around, they won't stay, and you'll have turnover. You won't be able to retain the best people. So you want to always attract the very best candidates. And then once you have them, you want to have them stick around. You want to retain them. So salary does matter, and it matters so much in your competitive stance. So let's look at a few laws that really are pertinent here that talk about this idea of direct compensation. We didn't get any real labor standards that governed what is a work week, how do we handle it, what types of employees are there, what standards should we set. This was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And so until that time, there were no rules about workplace safety, about the conduct or treatment of minors in the workplace, how many hours should you work, all of those things. Um, and so this law is very significant, and this should be something that all HR managers should know about. And indeed, all managers should be aware of this law because it sets the foundation of everything we do regarding pay and compensation and so forth. And these are the things that we have to follow legally in the workplace regarding our workforce and so forth. Well, the first thing that we want to remark about is we got a division of employees and identified who is who in that sense. So we have what's called exempt employees and we have non-exempt employees. Now, let's just look at the non-exempt first. If someone is non-exempt from something, that means it applies to them. So non-exempt employees are all those employees who the FLSA applies to, all the rules and regulations. And the exempt employees are those employees that are not held to those standards. So uh, the easiest way to think about this is salaried versus operating employees. Managers are exempt employees. Uh, and the way to understand this easiest is, do you punch a time clock or not? Or as well, do you also have supervisory duties over other people? If you don't punch a time clock, you're on salary, that your hours could vary every week, regardless of what you want to do, and so forth, and you do supervise people and you make a minimum type of money, you're an exempt employee. And therefore, the FLSA standards don't apply to you. So overtime rules, 40 hours in a week, sick leave, vacation pay could be different. Everything would be different for exempt employees in many different respects. So there are some caveats, though, here, some minimum thresholds to meet, and so forth. Um, with very few exceptions, an exempt employee has to be paid a minimum wage of $23,600 a year. This is about $450 a week or so. Um, but that is the minimum threshold. If someone is called a manager at some job or an assistant manager and they're treated that way and not held subject to being paid overtime, they're not tracking their hours, and they don't make $23,600 a year, you're legally violating the law. And so you want to keep these sorts of restrictions in mind. And they also have to be paid not on an hourly basis, but on a salary basis. Um, and they have to perform duties that are considered what an exempt employee would do. And generally, there are some tests to meet. I'll tell you about some of them. The salary level is one test. And certainly, it's guaranteed that employees who make over $100,000 or more are pretty much exempt employees. They're almost certainly exempt if anybody reports them whatsoever. Um, some jobs in the statutes are classified as exempt by definition. So there are certain industries and occupations that are also subject to different rules, different laws, and so forth. One example I can give you of that is outside sales employees. They are considered exempt employees. Most of the time you would say, well, these aren't really managerial people, but at the same time, they're in a unique situation. They're not working at the home office or any particular office. They're out in the field, in a region, in a district of some type. And so therefore they're exempt because their pay structure is going to be a little bit different. They may, because they're sales types employees, get a base salary, and then the rest of their compensation, the direct payment they get, is based on the level of production they are able to achieve and so forth, whatever conditions that the company or the organization sets up. Um, so non-exempt employees, those who are subject to the standards, that is pretty much everybody else, all operating employees certainly. And they are entitled to the provisions that are provided for in the law. So after 40 hours a week, they get overtime pay. For holidays, they get holiday pay, and so forth. Now, generally, these are set as standard rates, time and a half for overtime, double time or triple time, though for holidays can vary between organizations. So there's a little wiggle room for what organizations will pay and what they're mandated to pay, but they still have to follow the rules. Um, Non-exempt employees, anybody who makes less than that $23,600 level, regardless of what the organization says their job is or their duties, are considered non-exempt, and they have to have the payroll deductions and so forth taken out. There are some exclusions here to tell you about. Like I said earlier, some particular jobs might be completely excluded from coverage under this act, and under, in particular, the overtime rules of the act. So there are two general types of complete exclusion. The jobs that are specifically named and excluded in statutes themselves. An example of this is employees of movie theaters, believe it or not, and also many agricultural workers. They are not governed by FLSA overtime rules. In particular, the agricultural workers, it gets a little complicated because we don't always use citizens to do our agricultural work. We have a lot of immigrant labor, green cards, legally here to do the work and things like that. They're covered by different rules. And so they do not get time and a half. Their hours are a little bit different, but they are excluded by statute because they're mentioned. And the same thing with movie theater operators. Because of the show times and the varying schedules and things like that, the government felt at the time they put the law together that this occupation is unique enough and has particular characteristics that it just doesn't work out to hold them to these standards. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have standards, because they will be covered under other regulations and laws and so forth. Now, as a general rule, if a job is governed by some other federal law, then that federal law supersedes the FLSA, and that specific industry is governed by the regulations pertinent to them. For example, most railroad workers, they are governed under the Railway Labor Act. And that sets all the standards for how they get paid, the rules they have to follow, the legalities of the organizations, the types of payments they have to make and they don't have to make, and so forth. As well, Many truck drivers. I'm not sure what the distinction between different types of truck drivers is, but we have the Motor Carriers Act, and they are governed by that rather than the FLSA. And they have particular standards and so forth. And certainly what I do know about the transport industry and truck drivers in particular, that they are governed by rules, how many hours they're allowed to drive at one time, how much rest they should take. And so certainly having rules like that do make it difficult to have a 40-hour week. It makes it difficult to have an 8-hour day and so forth, because you are conforming to rules that are really put there for the benefit of society as much as anything, for safety, accountability, and so forth. Now, there are a few other laws to talk about here that do govern compensation. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 was the first time that we really spoke to the differences in pay between genders. Um, it prohibits unequal pay differences for men and women who are performing equal work on jobs requiring equal skill, effort, and responsibility. Um, of course, passing a law doesn't make problems go away necessarily. And this is in 1963. Well, here today in 2021, we still have disparity in pay in a general sense. There are plenty of examples and instances today where you can say women do make more than men, but it's in some industries, some jobs, some regions. If we added up men and women doing the same job uh, nationally for the with exactly the same skills and so forth, we find that there could be as much as a 23 to 28% difference in favor of men's pay. And this has been going on for a long time. I think it is improving, and eventually we will get to total gender equality here for pay. But we've had 60 years ago a law that says we ought to be doing this, and we still haven't achieved it yet. Um, we also have the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This amended the famous Civil Rights Act of 1964 to a small extent. If you remember the Civil Rights Act of 64 we've talked about, that is the one with Title VII that created the EEOC and put in a lot of language about equity and fairness and hiring and all of those sorts of things. Well, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act says if someone files a claim for discrimination in their pay because of unequal pay, so this is related to the Equal Pay Act in its way, that there's no time limit that's going to kick you out, and all of a sudden your ability to file and get this satisfied through no fault of your own, if the legalities take a long time, from being dismissed. So every day, or let me put it this way, every time you would receive a paycheck from the organization, if you have a legal dispute on the books, a legal action, then it resets the time limit to 180 days more as of the date you receive that latest payment from them. So it makes sure that basically the other side cannot get out of the litigation and so forth, that people do get a fair hearing in court. Now, here's a terrific graphic that shows us direct compensation. These are the main things that we see in textbooks that talk about this topic. One thing to be said about direct compensation, it's easy to understand. It's a direct payment to you. You get a check in your paycheck, and you get it for various reasons. As long as the money is paid to you, whether it's pay, wages, or if it's a reimbursement for some out-of-pocket expense you've had, then that is direct compensation. You receive some money. So we break it down beyond just the salary or the paycheck payment. Notice there are some elements here that would appear not to be pay. And so I'm kind of referring up here to these medical reimbursements. Sometimes you make medical payments and the details have to be sorted out later for whatever reason. And it's determined that you paid too much. The company has a health plan. They're going to reimburse you. When you receive that money back from the company as a reimbursement for money you've spent that you're entitled to get back, that's a direct payment. Therefore, it's considered direct compensation. Still not a benefit if you get money, and that's the difference. So some expense you've incurred in your course of being an employee are covered and approved, and you're eligible. Direct payment happens, then you could consider that direct compensation. So your health insurance package and all the details in that are not direct payments. That's a policy. So think about the difference there to compare. Health insurance, a standing plan that says if something happens, we will do this, the organization will, and you'll receive this. Well, that's indirect, right? That's a benefit. So this is quite different. Direct compensation is really about the money. Um, the fact that you get a direct payment of money is all it takes to classify something as direct. Now, the same could be said for a leave travel allowance. I'm eligible for leave travel allowances uh, if approved and it meets the right criteria. So I have to pay out of pocket for it the way our system works here for faculty. So if I want to go to a conference or if I want to go somewhere to do some research and it's approved, I can submit forms later, get paid mileage or whatever the rules are, and submit receipts, and I would get a direct payment back, a leave travel allowance. And the same thing for conveyance or maybe an allowance for rent, is anything that's paid to you as direct money. So these aren't benefits, these are direct payments. I would think that you kind of get what a direct compensation really is all about. Now, many things are going to affect our level of compensation. We all go into an organization when we are looking for work, when we decide to work somewhere or get a job offer. We have perceptions and expectations. And at the minimum, everyone has perceptions of hopefully things will be fair and equitable. We really will want to pick organizations to work for that are going to pay us a competitive wage. So it's up to HR managers to make sure that the organization is paying the best that they can do within their own means, within the competitive structure that you're in, your industry you're in, and so forth, the sector even. And so you have to realize that there are differences in pay scales in different regions of the country. Some places simply cost more to live than others. Pay has to be adjusted in those areas. So people will make more there, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are living better. They're just compensating for the differences in the cost of living. And so compensation sometimes, the amount you get is also affected by, well, how many benefits, the indirect stuff, is the organization also offering that they can say, well, we're not paying as much, but look at these other terrific things we're offering you, and this is worth something too. And indeed, all that indirect stuff is really considered about 1/3 of your overall compensation package. But here, let's stay directed on direct payments. But you need to know a way to be able to compare it. So the organization, if it cannot pay what the competitive labor wage market is in any given region, they're at a competitive disadvantage. You will not be number one in your market. You won't get the most growth and market share, and you may not attract the best people, and you may not retain them either. Um, and so you've got to keep the idea that fairness really does matter because of the employee equation going on, but at the same time, you have to be able to afford to do it. Um, and it's all about the expectations that workers really do have. So we really have to move and talk about equity, which is the fairness I've been mentioning. Everyone is doing a mental subconscious comparison a lot of times of how hard am I working? What skills am I contributing to this organization? And what am I getting back? Am I getting paid enough for it? Um, and it is about perception. It's easy for employees to go online and find out what average pay is for the region in any given job. You can go look up your job description in a general way, go to some databases and see what's paid in different areas. And then you can compare that to what you're getting and say, okay, they've got it right, or, they're not really where they ought to be. And I should look around for some other organizations to work for that are going to, well, treat me better, pay me more. But we have all sorts of things that get in the way of us as an organization being able to do things that are necessary to make our employees happy, to pay them the most, to keep them around. For instance, we have compression. Now, compression is a situation when salaries for jobs that you have and that you're filling openings from the external world there, the wages for those jobs that you're hiring people at are rising higher than the wages for people already in the job. So you get into a position where it happens in higher education to professors all the time. You get hired for a salary, You get your increases regularly every year, like normal and so forth. But then the cost of living goes up. Um, Particular talent is harder to find, so it's worth more. And new people coming in with less experience and skill can get hired for the same rate as someone who's been here many years or even a higher rate. You could see the problems that would cause, the perceptual problems. People, when they find these things out, uh, they feel like they're not being treated fairly, that maybe they're being cheated, and this causes retention problems. People will leave if they find enough anger about it. So compression is just a real factor out there in the world. And sometimes companies simply have to raise the pay of the incumbents, an incumbent, of course, being someone in a job. Whenever you get that situation where new hires are coming in at almost the same exact rate or more that the incumbents are making, that's certainly an inequitable situation, and you have to be careful of that. So this is just another thing that HR managers have to be aware of. We've also got the challenge of grade creep, where you have to reclassify a job position to another higher grade that really doesn't exist in your pay structure. The employee is already at the top, and they're incredibly skilled and they're good at their job with expertise, and they're a valued employee and so forth. Uh, you can't simply not give them any more raises. So you give them some higher compensation despite no change in the job structure overall and so forth. You have to continue giving increases, rewarding performance and production and effort. You want to retain people. And certainly you would not want to lose through turnover people through grade creep that are at the peak of their skills just because they're in top pay. So quite often what happens to these individuals, companies will make sure that they get a cost of living increase at the minimum, so much percent of their salary and so forth, or the wages. So there are ways that we can get better at this notion of achieving this employee equity so that there's a real harmonious balance and interaction between the organization and the employees. When people feel fairly treated, in particular with their pay, they are more motivated, inspired, they're better organizational citizens, and all of that stuff. So when we talk about achieving the equity, we're really talking about internal factors we have to deal with and some external factors that affect this equity. Well, the external factors are something I've talked about. The external labor market, what rates are being paid out there in different regions, how do companies handle it, what are they really paying, and so forth for the same job descriptions offered in different locations, and so forth. And you can have big differences within a region as well, and you have to pay attention to that. For instance, public sector jobs in a city. Depending on the size of the city, the same job could be paid considerably more or less, depending. So those external factors really do have a significant impact on trying to achieve this equity. Now, when we look internally, this is a standard that requires employers to set your wages within your organizations that correspond to what you consider as an organization the value of that job to the company. So you're dealing with the external factors. What is everybody else paying? And how do we view this job? Is it important, highly important, incredibly important, or just a minimal sort of importance to the organization? That affects how much you feel that you want to pay, and so forth. And there are different methods to use to determine this. And so you can see it is really much a balancing act between what's going on out there in the real world of competition and how are we handling what's going on within the organization? What method are we going to use to achieve this fairness that we really want? So you can rank jobs to say, these are the best jobs in the company, the most important, and these are the least important. And so what you would do is you would just make a list of jobs, highest to lowest, according to their perceived value to the organization. You can classify jobs in different ways that reflect their differences from different perspectives. For instance, all the accountants ought to be working in the accounting department, and people with marketing degrees and knowledge ought to be in the marketing or something in those areas. You classify different types of jobs in certain areas that make sense. So this is a reasonable way to classify your jobs. But once you do that, you've still got to return to the external factors and say, now that I've ranked these jobs, this is the job description. What is everybody else in the region or the world or our country? What are they paying? You can use something called the factor comparison. You assign uh, compensable factors to each particular job. It gives you a number. You rate the numbers and compare them. You can make a list and say, using these factors, these specific factors, these are the best and least important jobs to the company. The point method is very similar, assigning factors, or in this case, assigning points. You rate jobs on compensable factors again, you add up the scores on all of it, and you get a point total. And this tells you what is your most significant, valuable job in the company versus the ones at the bottom. So this is a way to determine pay rates and so forth, and to achieve that equity. And of course, there's always things out of your control. Despite your best efforts to ensure this equity, a number of factors are going to affect compensation that are outside your ability to do anything about. Um, the demand for certain skills might be in short supply. So you're competing heavily with other organizations for that best talent. That will cause the price of that talent to go up. You've got to pay higher wages and salaries and so forth in cases where people are in demand. That's the kind of job you want, isn't it? Where you have a powerful skill in demand that might be somewhat unique and not easy to learn. Those are the sorts of things that, from the employee's perspective, that are very powerful. Um, we also have to look at jobs that have very unpleasant work conditions or hazardous conditions uh, in the job itself, and they have to be paid more. People don't want to do those jobs. How about sanitation workers? Not a pleasant job, physical, outside all the time, hard work, could be somewhat dangerous. Some toxic things can happen to you. But think about it. People won't stay in that job. They won't do that job unless they're compensated pretty well. So it may not be a glamorous job title, but you might make a better living working for a sanitation company than you would as a fast food worker. And so because of the hazardness or the unpleasantness of the job, it's still a doable physical labor job. And it's going to have to be compensated in a manner that makes up for those challenges, those things that you just have to deal with. Now we also have pay differentials. This is really talking about the structure of your pay system itself. Are we using steps where it's published? When you get hired at such and such a step in your particular job title. And every particular time period specified by the company, you're eligible to move to the next step. In other words, get a pay raise and a promotion, and you move up, 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 up. And when you get to the top, then you're in a situation where you have grade creep, right? Um, but there are different ways to set up these classifications, these pay structures. We use longevity pay is one thing that we can create. It rewards employees who have reached the pay grade maximum. So not only a cost of living increase might work for grade creep when people reach the top pay, longevity pay, you can give someone an increase. They're not likely to move into a higher grade because there isn't one. So you basically give them a raise anyway, call it longevity pay. Why would you call it that? You want them to stick around. You want their longevity is what you're thinking about. And so it makes sense. That's why it's called that. Now, broad banding or pay banding is really just creating classifications of jobs, steps within the jobs, and so forth. Your salary grades are all evident. You can look at them. You can predict where you'll be, how long it will take to make the next wage, where you can be over time. And of course, these schedules of how much pay increase and how much they are can change. The organization will change them if suddenly the skills in a particular broadband or a pay band, depending on what you call it, become in more demand, harder to find people to do it. You've got to go in and those numbers will change. And so we just have different ways to do it. Skill-based pay is determined on the number of tasks or job you do in a particular job description, or a particular amount of expertise or job knowledge that you have. Skill-based will give sometimes some extra pay. Um, and it is good to know that you can be rewarded for the abilities you have and the things that you know how to do. And it does seem to be an element of fairness. Now, merit pay, here is where we give people an increase as a reward for performance. It's not got anything to do with their seniority or trying to make equality of pay or equity or the need or anything like that. This is strictly, you have done great performance production in things that we have measured and that we want and we've been looking for, and this is a reward. And so merit pay, gain sharing, and goal sharing both, these are a couple of ways to handle pay that are really about teamwork. Gain sharing, for instance, a team bonus program. It measures costs. If you finish a project, you stay within costs, everybody will get a bonus. The bonus is the same for every member. It's no different for the chair or the operating members of the committees and so forth. And goal sharing is just a different way to structure this sort of idea. It's a group incentive plan. Again, it's based on a team or a task force that's doing something. And the payment of some kind of reward at the end or bonus, whatever you want to name it is fine, but it is a payment. And it's linked to the achievement of performance goals. It could be all or nothing. It could be prorated to achievement of some of the goals, particularly on very challenging tasks and so forth that committees or task forces might be working on. Now, state and local government have minimum wages. The federal government sets a federal minimum wage. I'm not sure if I'm entirely correct here, but I think it's around $7.20 an hour right now. Now, certainly people cannot live on $7.20 an hour, and that is the real problem. But states are theoretically not supposed to set a minimum wage that is lower than that. In other words, federal law always supersedes local laws. Now, state laws can supersede the federal law if they offer more pay, a higher minimum wage, but they can't say in our state you make less than $7.20 an hour. Although, for some reason, I believe there is one state, Wyoming, out there that offers a couple dollars less than $7.20 an hour as their state minimum wage. It's been on the books a long time. I think the only reason that it is still there, because it's obviously not legal, is because no one has challenged it in court. And so there is that. But generally, state laws cannot abrogate federal laws, but they can require the higher one. Now, today we have a condition in our country, indeed around the world, but in America, a living wage. And you've probably heard this referred to in discussions. Well, a living wage is that amount of money a working person could make in a 40-hour normal week doing a job that would provide enough money for them and a small nuclear family like we have in America to live on. And what is that in America? Well, it's two people, a family, and maybe one dependent is fairly normal. You should be able to go out, according to the people that say we need a living wage. It's the only way to have real equity and fairness. And we just don't see that happening all over the country. We see the rich and the corporations getting richer and richer and paying less and less tax, and the regular employees, the exempt employees everywhere, making less and less, fewer increases, smaller increases, and indeed people working two jobs or more, and upright, hardworking people that can't live. And they end up working a 40-hour job at Walmart, and they have to be on food stamps in some parts of the country. And I'm just saying Walmart because I know that this happens with Walmart. It doesn't happen in all the regions that Walmart operates in all their stores. From my research, Walmart is a very schizophrenic company, very inconsistent, very much dependent on local and regional managers, how they act and treat people. And a living wage is very controversial. Well, we've just had a new election. The incoming administration has said one of the things they will do immediately is reset the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So can you imagine how this will affect people in a sense of business? For one thing, the sense of equity is going to rise. People are going to feel a lot better. They won't have to, as many of them won't have to have food stamps or have a second job. And the truth of it is, this is not going to destroy business. And that's the biggest argument you hear against a living wage. Now, we do have a case study in the course that I've written about Walmart and living wage, where I bring up these controversial issues. And I find it highly interesting, and I think it's something that its time has come. and we should pay attention to it. We if, from my way of thinking, a country like ours, people should not be working 40 hours a week and be at the poverty level. So that's the living wage thing. You want to be aware of that as an HR manager and as an organization. Pay if you can. Have people stick around. You will do better as an organization together, and you will make more money. So the living wage is an income that would provide for a family's basic needs in a particular community or region, depending on where you live. Sometimes we do see right now certain cities, counties around the country that already mandate that workers in certain types of industries and so forth will be paid this minimum wage. And that has the weight of law, but it only has the weight of law in those local areas and so forth. So a federal minimum wage would be a fantastic standard because it would be the threshold. And states wouldn't be able to say, no, in Missouri, we're going to give you $10.50 an hour, whether you like it or not. We don't care what the feds say. That would no longer be legal. And so the justification behind these is that we shouldn't be using our tax dollars to support people that are working hard, that are employed, that are doing everything that we expect normal people to do, to have jobs and to provide for their families. We shouldn't have to support them with tax dollars because they're not being paid enough. And remember, this is not a condition where organizations can't afford to pay. Our organizations, top 500 S&P and the Dow and all of that, those companies are doing quite well, and they can certainly afford it. The ripple effect, think about what you know about business, of people making more money. What do they do with their money? The average person does not go shuttering it away in the bank or under the mattress. They spend that money. When you spend the money, business activity increases. People keep their jobs, people create new jobs, new businesses. A living wage is smart. I'm not an economist, I will admit it right away, and a good economist could tear me up, I'm sure, in all of this. But it does seem logical and reasonable. And then we've got this idea of comparable worth that sort of is a theme running throughout this whole discussion. The idea that each job itself has some sort of inherent value or worth, and you can compare it to other jobs. That's why we can actually use a ranking system to say, CEO job is the most important in the company because they set strategy and plan for us and do everything. And maybe the maintenance people outside are the lowest job. And these are not to say one thing is better than another. That's not what the discussion is about. It's the value to the organization, the significance of the tasks and things get done. Certainly, it's got to be pretty important that someone's making decisions to leave the organization versus someone is doing the landscaping. So I think you can understand the comparable worth. But just because we divide things up that way doesn't mean that we should discriminate. We should treat people fairly. And so this is a discussion that is coming out of the socio-economic sphere of our country. And as we know, the various different elements in our business context drive and force these things. So we're really talking here about a lot of external factors, right? Here's a comparative list for you, just for some of the things I've said. I mentioned that you could be paid in a given region where the rates are fairly stable, the same job in different cities. Let's look at the city clerk. City clerk, City A makes $42,000 a year. City E, $66,000. Obviously, medium city, small city, big city, differences. And you can see the highest and the lowest. You can gather this information quite easily. It's out there. You can find out the midpoint. There are different ways to say, how am I going to determine what to pay? What are my competitors doing? Are they here around the highest minimum? Are they here around the midpoint? Are they paying around the lowest minimum, and so forth? You look at these factors, you try and figure it out. You do it in a competitive, strategic manner. Remember, we want to think strategically as HR managers. Now, executive compensation and benefits, this is a different ballgame. Executives are hired in a different manner than regular employees. They're hired differently than regular managers for the most part. And we do find these differences and so forth. In the public sector, for instance, executives are exempt from civil service protection. Many of them serve at the discretion of elected officials. It's an appointed political job. And so therefore, if the person who appointed you is no longer happy with your performance, you're out the door. That's what can happen in the public sector. That's not to say that every managerial job in the public sector is like that. The politically appointed jobs are, but there are many of them, particularly when you start working for higher up in state and federal government agencies. Those public agencies are going to have political appointees who direct policy and so forth. And these are the people I'm talking about. Well, the people that run these agencies are considered executives, like CEOs and presidents in the private sector, like presidents and CEOs in the nonprofit sector. So we do find a lot of commonalities here. So they serve at the discretion of whoever hired them. For instance, here at Westminster College, we're a nonprofit organization. We have a board of trustees, governors, basically, that handle policy. The president of our college serves at the discretion of the board. And as soon as the board is no longer happy with them, they terminate their contract and it's over. Just like that. So we do say the same thing in the nonprofit sector. We're in the nonprofit, but we see it in the public sector in particular, like I was mentioning. Because both of those sectors, positions at the top, the executive positions lack some security, and in particularly in the private sector, executives are likely to negotiate their employment contracts. And these negotiations specify the level of compensation and all the variety of benefits they will receive. So what are some common benefits that we find in these executive contracts? Well, they negotiate their severance pay in case they do get let go unexpectedly. There's an exact dollar amount put in. There's an exact amount depending on certain conditions. Whatever happens, you get this stock award or you don't get it. You get this base pay or you don't get it. You get this lump sum amount. And these things are all specified and they're contractual. But you get other things related to just working there. Moving expenses, quite often a top executive will get all the moving of their family from one end of the country or region to another paid for. They usually get the same health, retirement, and disability insurance as the rest of the employees of an organization because everyone is part of a group plan. But sometimes they are offered certain other perks that aren't available to others or certain better deals. Depends on the company, how they negotiate those with their providers and so forth. But they do exist and they are some of the things, one of the things that could be negotiated. They also pay, in some instances, you can negotiate to have professional association membership dues paid. These can be expensive, just depends on what organization. Professionals are members of various organizations and societies and things that give them career development and industry insight and things like that. I renew my membership pretty much every year with the Society for Human Resource Management, so I can stay on top of things, that I can get information from their wonderful website and reports and the latest thinking on what's happening on new laws and things like that. And it would be nice to have that paid, but it has to come out of pocket for me. They will also, you can negotiate that conferences that you might go to and attend. You may not realize how expensive conferences are, but they run sometimes into the, well, quite often into the thousands of dollars, not to mention the cost of getting there, the accommodations for staying and living while you're there. Sometimes these will last 4 days, a week, something like that, all the associated expenses. You can negotiate that as an executive and get that put in your contract. Let me share a quick little article here and tell you a few things about this executive pay average here. Oh, wrong one. Let me try again. This is how much more money CEOs make than the typical American. Now, this is 5 years old. CEO to worker pay ratio is 335 to 1. Does that sound like equity? I wanted to show you one thing in particular here. This is done from research on the S&P 500 companies earning 335 times the pay of the average worker. But down here, I wanted to show you one thing. The AFL-CIO, this is one of the largest labor organizations in the country. They did some research. They looked at the S&P 500 companies, and they looked at the levels of unrepatriated profits that these corporations are earning. Now, what is an unrepatriated profit? Well, thank goodness they tell us right here. These are profits that an organization has made that they have put in overseas banks. They call it here, they stash them in overseas banks. And the reason they use that term was because they want to avoid paying taxes in America. And this is controversial. This is not doing your fair share. This is one of the reasons why workers make so little and CEOs make so much. They want to avoid paying taxes. The analysis found that 25 companies that have the most of this unrepatriated profit money stashed in foreign banks, the executive pay in those particular corporations 79% higher than other companies. So in other words, it goes way above 335 to 1. And look at this comparison here. In 1980, the difference between CEO pay to worker pay was 42 to 1. That's a little bit more reasonable for that expertise, that value to the organization I've been talking about, to where it is in 2016. And I would bet certainly that this is much harder now. So you can say we do have some troubles, some social troubles. When companies make billions of dollars, like Walmart, like Amazon, like Google, like Apple, like many, many companies that we could make a list of, and they pay zero taxes. I pay more taxes than Walmart or Google or any of it, and so do you. So questions of equity are certainly really important, to workers and to the HR department. Let's take a look at some other information here. Let's compare ourselves to some other market economies that are very similar to ours. Japan, an Asian country that is the closest thing to a Western sort of economy that you'll ever see. They do everything pretty much the way we do it. We learned working in task force and teams from the Japanese. Look at their CEO worker to CEO ratio, 11 to 1. Germany, mature market economy like us. France, Italy, Canada, South Africa, Britain. These here pretty much have market economies like ours. Look at these differences. And look where we are according to this particular stat. I would say this one probably a little newer than some of my stats, 475 to 1. So we're the worst at this in the entire world. And when we compare ourselves to others who are similar to us in form and substance of how we go about doing business, we're out of whack. And so it says something about our society. And you can see here some bar graphs that really do some compare. Here's the CEO pay. Here's the average US pay. This is the growth. This is how much growth during this 24-year period we saw in pay. Let's compare. The average US employee, the operating workers, the worker bees, it went up 0.3%. That's their pay. CEO pay went up 8.5%. And so forth. The GDP went up this much, corporate profits up this much, and this is only to 2004. Right now, these bar graphs are up here somewhere for 2021. I like this graphic when I saw it because I think it's very effective. The average worker has to work 1,372 hours to equal 1 hour of the CEO's pay at Walmart. Think about that. How many weeks of your paycheck is that? That is considerable. That is most of a year to equal 1 hour of their pay. So let me wrap this up for you and talk about some of the things that I've mentioned. When we do our compensation systems, we have to think strategically. We want to show the worth of the department in that strategic sense. So what do? We want to design pay systems and mechanisms and procedures that we get the best people, that we motivate them when we get them, and that retain them. The factors, we have to deal with it. It doesn't matter regardless of sector, public, nonprofit, private. You've got to look at those external factors and say, what is going on out there? What do we have to respond to? But at the same time, we have to follow the law. So we've got to know which provisions of the FLSA apply to us and which don't. Which other laws are in force? Equal Pay Act, for instance, things like that. And let's never forget that as HR managers thinking strategically, everything we're going to do, everybody we hire, all our decisions are based on obtaining the proper KSOCs for the jobs that we have. And so we've got to deal with our ability to pay as well as all these other factors. So internal factors, external factors, really set the tone for how we act and the things that we can do. We want to keep in the back of our minds at all times that we want equity, and we want our employees to perceive that they are being paid fairly. We want to attract the best, we want to keep the best. When it comes to the various sectors that we work in, whether it is profit, nonprofit, public sector, we always want to keep in mind the key skills, abilities, and other characteristics of the people we're hiring. We want their professional experience, we want their expertise, and we may have to negotiate a little bit, and we may have to be a little bit flexible and adaptable in the direct sort of compensation that we're ready to provide. Okay, folks, that's it for this time. I'll talk to you again soon.